Okay, yoga friends, let's talk about pigeon pose. Now, you might have caught this in some of my other videos, but I think it deserves a little video nugget all of its own to come back and visit pigeon pose, what it's doing to your knee, what it's doing to your body, and why there are two pigeons and not just one. So let's dive in. First of all, yoga superstars, there are two pigeons and not one, and we need to understand that these are different poses. So in yoga, we do a lot of funny shapes, and for some reason, pigeon, upright pigeon, and pigeon with a forward folding pigeon have somehow got the same name. And I understand why, because it's sort of easy to move one into the other, but they are very different poses. So let's start by taking a look at that. So pigeon pose is this guy. Right here, I'm doing pigeon pose. I might bring my arms up and grab my foot if I had longer arms, right? So this is pigeon pose, but then this is also called pigeon pose or sleeping pigeon pose. But as we'll see, they're totally different. So let's break them down one at a time. So first of all, this active pigeon pose, which is what I'm going to call it, active pigeon pose or upright pigeon pose. Let's take a look. What does this pose remind you of? And let's look at a normal version. This one's super intense and super crazy where you grab the foot, but just looking at this, kind of the entry stage into it, what pose does this remind you of? Well, probably a low lunge, maybe a high lunge, maybe a bit of a back bend, right? So this upright pigeon pose is a big hip flexor stretch. This is what I'm doing in this pose, right? I'm stretching the front of my hip. It's also a back bend, especially when we start getting down into this version where I grab my foot, right? You can see the intention of this pose is moving to a quad stretch and to a big back bend in the back body. So we have hip flexor stretch, back bend, quad stretch. This is a back bending posture, everybody. So it has more in common with things like high lunge with a back bend, Dhanurasana, bow pose, Natarajasana, dancer's pose. That's all what's in kind of this pose's world. Those are the poses that are similar and do similar things in the body. Now let's look at the other pose, sleeping pigeon, okay? So this is the one where you're like, oh, meow, 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 right, and fall asleep here. So what is this pose doing? Am I stretching my hip flexor? No, not anymore, right? Because I forward folded. Now I'm neutral here. So what am I doing exactly? Am I doing a back bend? No, I'm not. My spine is straight. So what exactly is happening? I'm stretching my outer hip. This guy in the front, this hip is getting a stretch, right? Here it is. So this pose has more in common with Gomukhasana, outer hip stretch. Maybe Bakasana a little bit, Sukhasana with a forward fold, thread the needle on your back. All of those are targeting the outer hip. Also, this pose, I'm down, right? I'm close to the earth. My body weight is being supported by the floor in this second version here. The meow meow, right? So this is a more cool down pose and a stretching pose that's targeting the outer hips. The other pose, the upright pigeon pose, actually we need to work out of gravity. So in pigeon number one, in order to prevent my back from hyperextending right here, because this is a back bend and a massive front hip opener, I need to lift up. Can you guys see this? The more that I lift up, the more I can get my tailbone down, right? So we gotta keep lifting out of this pose. This is an active pose to keep your students safe, to keep them from hyperextending their low back or going too far into this stretch. They have to squeeze in and actively lift up. They can come up here. That's great. They can use blocks under their hands. That's great. But in the forward fold, I'm letting it all go. It's a hip stretch. So just to reiterate, upright pigeon, active pigeon, hip flexor opener, back bend, could be quad stretch, arms overhead and flexion. Wow, intense. Big back bend, active, have to lift up and engage, super strong, like Dhanurasana, bow pose, or dancer's pose. Pigeon number two, laying down pigeon, sleepy pigeon, outer hip stretch, similar to thread the needle, cow face pose, Gomukhasana, Sukhasana with a forward fold, Agni-stambhasana, double pigeon as they were, or fire log pose. And that is more of a cooling, restorative, stretchy out pose. So now that we understand the difference between these two poses, that they are radically different, let's talk about how to do each one of them safely. See, I'm a little concerned about something called the knee, having busted my poor little baby knee up before. I'm very conscientious about taking care of them. So I just want to talk to you about some best practices here. So when we're doing upright pigeon, right, which is essentially like a low lunge, except for I've put my shin down. Notice what happens. The shin coming down gives me more surface area to connect to. Great. It also lets me get a little lower down to the ground, which is going to be useful eventually when I go into those more advanced variations where I have to get my pelvis a little bit lower. That's going to be helpful here. But I do want you to notice the angle of my shin. Do you guys see how the angle of my shin is quite modest? In fact, if I show you from the front, it's about here, like 30 degrees, maybe 45. And I want to tell you why. Just in case you happen to be from that school, or I've heard teachers say to place their shin parallel to the front of the mat, I'm here to suggest that maybe this is a better way to do this particular pose. And I'm going to show you with the help of blocks. Generally speaking, our knees really like to be a pure hinge joint. Yes, our knees have some capacity for rotation. If you want to learn more about the knee, go check out my Anatomy of the Knee course. We explained it all. But basically, knees like to be a pure hinge for the sake of yoga, right? When we're yoga teachers within our scope of practice, that's a safe place to keep our students. So I want you to imagine for a moment that here I am sitting in Vajrasana, and here's my femur, and here's my tibia, and they're nicely stacked on top of each other. Awesome sauce. Okay, when I come into my pigeon pose, now I've externally rotated about this much. Can you see? Still a hinge. Most everybody can externally rotate this much. If I'm asking my students to come down and place their shin parallel to the front of the mat, I'm asking the hip to externally rotate this much. Now, if I have my butt down, then I'm golden, no problem. You can see this is still a hinge joint, no worries. But my friends, as soon as I start to lift my leg up, and I'm okay here, you don't have to worry about me, but as soon as I start to lift myself up, my thigh, in order to get my pelvis off the ground, is going to start turning in like this. It's going to start lifting up. And what that's doing is creating pressure here. Check out this really awesome illustration from Ray Long's book. So in this book, you can see somebody doing Padmasana, lotus pose. Here's their thigh, right? Here's their knee. And because they don't have external rotation, you can see because the hip is lifting up a little bit here, this area of the knee is beginning to get compressed. This is your meniscus. This is important. We do not want to squish the meniscus. No, so we want to keep everything like a hinge. So all of that is to say, when you're setting your students up for an active pigeon pose upright, the shin being about 30 degrees, whatever, heel underneath the opposite hip, that's about as far as you want to go. The more you force the shin to be straight, the more external rotation you're requiring of this hip. And not everybody has that external rotation. And besides, the external rotation in this pose is not the point. Remember, this is like a lunge. The point of this pose is I'm stretching here, I'm creating a back bend, I add a quad stretch. So this isn't really a key part of the pose. Also, for those of you who are eventually going deeper into this pose and coming down, you can't have the shin parallel and come down all the way. Most of us can't. It's just not a nice relationship for the knee. So set your students up for success and for safety, and keep this heel tucked in, right? Another safety tip in teaching this pose, notice how my foot is pointed. Okay, now I know y'all have heard the phrase, flex the foot to protect the knee. And I'm here to tell you that's mostly a myth. If I flex my foot to protect my knee here, the movement of my ankle is actually going to cause my shin to roll in slightly. It's actually not allowing my shin to press down and to stay nice and even and a hinge joint with my thigh. So flexing the foot to protect the knee is really only something you would do if the shin were at 90 degrees. And even so, it's not that great a help because there are no muscles that are flexing your foot here that have anything to do with your knee. What it does do is it creates activation and awareness. Absolutely, it keeps your foot from sickling. It lifts the shin up. Great things, but it's not really a do or die thing for your knee. So in this position, shin nice and flat, and you're going to have to teach your students how to press down to lift up. In this pose, the active pigeon pose, gravity is pushing you down. It's like, come to me, right? Now, I have the capacity to do this, but I've really gone into my back and created some hyperextension. So if you have mobile students who are flexing in their back, who could just sit here and be like, I love pigeon, it's so great. You're gonna tell them to come up about 3 inches and work to maximize their strength, because that's what they need to work on. This is an active pose. You wanna lift it up, pull up that pelvic floor, squeeze the inner thighs in, get the tailbone down and protect your lower back. So let's talk about, now that we've talked a little bit about the upright pigeon, active, lifting up, all that good stuff, let's talk about this forward folding pigeon. Now in forward folding pigeon, the target here is the outer hip. Now you could teach that from this nice upright position if you want to. Keep the weight back. We don't want to push any weight down into the knee and have people walk forward. This is totally fine. I don't love this just because the hip is off the floor, and for me, if you're going to let people relax and go, it's kind of nice to put the hip on something, maybe a chip foam block or something like that. Or as an alternative, because the point is not to stretch the hip flexor, I'll start people in this yin pose, more like, swan pose, or we're getting to swan, deer pose. And what's nice about this is that my butt is down. So if you remember my nice little hinge joint of my knee here, if my hip stays glued to the floor, so I'm not moving the thigh, my knee stays at a hinge, there's no problem. I can go anywhere here, I can go over here. If I keep my hip down, I can extend my leg back. Because my hip is staying down, I'm not going to be rolling these 2 bones together. I'm keeping it stable so the knee stays in its happy place. Now, as soon as I lift my hip up, we're running into that same issue we did before where these 2 bones could knock together. So for me, because this is just about targeting the outer hip, because it's not so much about the back leg, because it's more passive and restorative and relaxing, I just change up the pose entirely. I have people come down, start off in deer, and forward fold. And why this is kind of nice is because it's a little easier now to change the angle of the knee. See, if my knee is here, and I forward fold, I'll get one kind of stretch in my hip. If my knee is here, adducted a little bit, I'll get a different kind of stretch in my hip. So it can be kind of fun to play with that from a very safe and stable position. Now the back leg, you may say, what's happening with the back leg? So let's say I'm starting off here. I could even have the shin parallel to the front of the mat. That's all good. My hip is staying down, not going to move this hip off the floor because I don't want these 2 bones to come into contact with each other, right, and smush. As I come down, because I tend to have some flexibility here, I can take my pelvis closer to the floor relative to my thigh, which looks like sleeping swan, right? So all I'm doing here is rolling the hip down. Am I doing that to keep my back leg straight and aligned? No. In fact, I don't care much for that particular cue because I'm prioritizing keeping the butt down. So this hip can go wherever it feels comfortable. It's fine. And then I can stay here and keep my weight on my hip and then just play, right? The knee can come back up if I need a little bit more support. The knee can go back if I can drop the hip down a little bit more and stretch a little bit more. It just depends on your body. But the point here, if I'm taking the leg back, isn't some sort of aesthetic, get that leg straight and in line with the socket. I don't care, right? If I take this leg back to get it straight and in line with the socket, I'm going to lift this hip up and again, smush my knee, which we don't want. So if I'm going to keep this thigh in a nice little hinge, this leg can just go wherever suits my hip and pelvis and structure the best. Okay, everybody, so I hope that gave you a good rundown of these two different pigeon poses. Active upright pigeon, big back bend, quad stretch, hip flexor stretch, squeezing in, lifting up. And then our forward folding pigeon, right, which is like more restorative, stretching the outer hip. So by understanding the different purposes of these two poses, that will give you more information about how to teach these poses to your students safely and with an eye to maximizing their purpose. So I hope that was super helpful. I hope that little clarification on the knee and treating it like a hinge joint was helpful. Again, subscribe for more tips. I'm so happy to have you as part of this community. If you have comments, questions, anything like that, put them in the comments below. Subscribe for more tips. Hang out with me on Instagram. So happy to have you here, you guys, and I'll see you on the mat.